So vaccine passports are a very contentious issue here in Canada. Lots of people think they're a good idea. There's a large segment of people that also think that they're a really bad idea. Today, we're going to talk with Christine Van Geyn about the situation. Christine is the Director of Litigation at the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Thanks for taking a few minutes to chat about this, Christine.
My pleasure.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think of the Canadian Constitution Foundation as a legal charity that goes out and fights for the little guy's constitutional rights in court. Is that a fair way of describing your organization?
Yeah, we're a legal charity that fights for fundamental freedoms in Canada, both in the courts of law and through public opinion and education.
And I want to ask you about it because you've written about it in C2C Journal, a couple interesting cases of people who I think probably should have an exemption from needing a vaccine passport. And I think it's actually the cases that you raised are ones that I think most reasonable people would say, yes, of course, we should grant them an exemption. But just before we get to that, I want to just talk briefly about the situation in Canada when it comes to vaccine passports. How does it work? Is there sort of a general description that you could give to viewers about what it's like in other jurisdictions? I think most people understand what's happening in their province, but what's happening in the country with vaccine passports?
Yeah, so when we use the term vaccine passport, we need to be specific, right? When I talk about vaccine passports, I'm talking about a government requirement to show proof of vaccination in order to enter a public space, like a theater, restaurant, museum, a bar, an arena, something like that. There are also, sometimes people refer to vaccine mandates as well. Those are more a private law issue, civil law issue that relate to employers imposing vaccination requirements on their employees. Although there are also some government mandates to employers. Some governments have mandated certain areas of the workforce to get vaccinated as well. But when I'm talking about vaccine passports, and for the purposes of this conversation, we're talking about showing proof of vaccination to enter a public space.
And then correct me if I'm wrong, but I think most people in the country now are living in jurisdictions where there are vaccine passport requirements. Quebec, Ontario, here in Alberta, we have them. BC, am I missing any jurisdictions?
The East Coast also has vaccine proof of vaccine requirements. It varies among the provinces. Then they all have different ones, and they're not necessarily compatible with one another. So if you travel to Ontario from British Columbia, the person checking your proof of vaccination at the door may be a little confused, but I mean, it's supposed to work, but I actually don't even know if the QR codes that are these scannable codes, if they are compatible among jurisdictions. So there are a lot of questions about that as well, but yes, most people in Canada are now living in a province that have a proof of vaccine requirement.
I've actually heard that same problem, that if you're in another province, you might not have the proper equipment to read the QR code, which was administered and given to the person in another province, because that technology is used somewhere else. But anyway, that's a whole other mess. But correct me if I'm wrong, but Ottawa is looking at bringing in their own vaccine passports. So perhaps if someone thinks that they're not covered right now and that they're going to get away without having one, that eventually it sounds like Ottawa is going to come in with their own requirement for everyone in the country. Is that correct?
Yeah, Ottawa has announced, the federal government's announced a proof of vaccine requirement to enter trains and airplanes, airplanes flying domestically within Canada or airplanes leaving Canada. It doesn't appear from the regulations like proof of vaccination is required to enter Canada, although obviously there are quarantine requirements for unvaccinated people entering the country.
Okay. All right. Well, let's get on to the stories that you raised, because I thought they were really interesting. Can you tell us about Erikas' case?
Yeah, so we're involved in a case in British Columbia with 3 people who are seeking medical exemptions from the proof of vaccine requirements for public spaces. There are about 4 individuals we're working with, and the first one is Erikas. She's a teenage girl who developed heart inflammation. It's called pericarditis, following her first dose of the Pfizer vaccine. This is a really rare side effect, but it is a side effect. And the British Columbia government has repeatedly stated that there are no medical exemptions to the vaccine passport policy. For all practical purposes, that's correct. Although the public health regulation that was published, there are actually two of them that govern vaccine passports in British Columbia. They actually do have something called a reconsideration, which is a way of getting an exemption, but I don't think anyone's actually been able to access it yet. So we're trying to get this reconsideration for Erika. She is a super clear-cut case. She developed a serious heart inflammation as a result of her first dose. Her physicians all tell her that she's ineligible for a second dose. She should not get it, but it's still incredibly difficult for us to get all the evidence together in order to get this reconsideration. It requires multiple meetings with her physicians, referrals to specialists, which itself can take months. Her current physician has given her a specialist referral to a cardiologist who won't be able to see her for months. So in order to get these specialist letters, in order to access this exemption, which is then subject to approval by public health in British Columbia, which has its own requirements that actually says pericarditis, this heart inflammation, is a reason for a deferral, not an exemption. I mean, the threshold for this girl to obtain a medical exemption is extremely, extremely high. She also has been isolated from her friends for, these last 2 years. It means she can't go to the types of public spaces that teenagers have been isolated from, where they like to go and hang out, like movie theaters. This girl is sick, and now she's ineligible to go and spend time. It is just a real cruelty that the government has imposed on people like her.
Yeah, and when I read your description of what she was going through in like say in that C2C journal column that you had, I thought, my goodness, like this seems to be common sense. Here was the girl who tried to get the vaccine, she got it. She was one of those unlucky few people that ended up having those serious side effects. My goodness, I mean, if there's a textbook case of someone who deserves an exemption, I think this would be it. Especially when you know
automatic. It should be automatic that she can get an exemption. She should just be able to get a simple letter from her physician. This is the process in Ontario. If a person in Erika's situation wants an exemption, they simply get a letter written from their doctor. It's not subject to public health approval. It doesn't require a specialist. It's a very straightforward procedure in Ontario. And on your charter rights, one of the ways the courts assess if there has been an unjustified infringement on your right. In Erika's case, it's her Section 7 right to liberty and security of person, and her right to equal treatment under the law. These rights can be limited, but one of the requirements is that the limit is minimally impairing. If Ontario can use a procedure that's actually accessible to people, that allows people to actually access medical exemptions, that's less impairing than the procedure in British Columbia. And while that's not determinative, it's certainly very good evidence that there's a better procedure that's available that the government should have adopted. And that's what we're asking for. We're asking for automatic exemptions for people like Erika to be allowed.
And the thing that strikes me is that you've got her doctor saying that she should not get a second dose. And yet we always hear politicians saying, we've got to listen to the science, listen to the science. Well, here they've got a doctor saying the best science understanding that we have is telling us to not give this girl a second dose, and the government's obstructing that.
The government hasn't said no.
They're making it hard.
Created so many barriers in order for her to access this exemption that for all practical purposes, it doesn't exist.
Yeah, it's the idea that the barriers are there when I think there should be, they should not be. I want to move on to Sharons' case. She was another case of a patient that, by all accounts, it sounds like she shouldn't have to get a second dose as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, so Sharon's physicians also tell her she should not get a second dose of the vaccine. Sharon is a woman in her 30s who wanted to get vaccinated. She got her first dose of the Pfizer vaccine, and following that, she developed a rare adverse reaction. It's called brachial neuritis. It involves a partial paralysis of, in her case, it's her arm and shoulder area. And this is connected to it's considered an adverse reaction to vaccines.
Mhm.
It is listed as a potential adverse reaction. And following her adverse reaction, she's doing physical therapy to try and regain movement, and she has actually got pregnant since that happened. Now, being a pregnant woman, she is incredibly worried about more nerve damage that could happen if she gets a second dose. She wants to be able to hold her baby when the baby's born. She might not even be able to do that. But more than that, she's afraid that more nerve damage from a second dose could hurt her baby. So her physicians, her specialists have advised her against getting a second dose, but public health has told her that she should get a second dose. So we're concerned, first of all, these complex neurological adverse reactions are extremely difficult to diagnose and require multiple referrals to specialists, which in our healthcare system can take an extremely long amount of time. All the while she's waiting for these referrals to specialists, she's excluded from engaging in all kinds of public activities. So she's waiting. Even when we get all of her medical records together and these referrals completed, we are concerned that public health may still deny the exemption for her, the reconsideration for her, because of what public health has already told us. And if her reconsideration is denied, it means when Sharon has her baby, she won't be able to go into public spaces like community centers that hold mommy and me classes for new moms and their babies. And the idea that we are in a current climate where the government thinks it's acceptable to isolate a new and disabled mother because of something she can't help it's despicable. It's despicable that the government won't accommodate a person like that. And that's what we're fighting for. I have broad concerns about vaccine mandates and the vaccine passport policy, but I have urgent concerns for people like Erica and people like Sharon and people like the other patients that we're working with in this case. That's why we're doing it.
And would BC be the, I'll use the term, the worst example in terms of making it extremely difficult to get these exemptions in Canada?
Manitoba is also pretty bad, I have to say. Manitoba also requires any patient who is seeking an exemption to also go through public health approval. They can't just have their doctor write a note. I have a really serious problem with the idea that of the government inserting itself between a patient and a physician and saying, you know, the physician is saying one thing, but we, the government, these public health bureaucrats, we know better. Even, especially when, in the case of Sharon, we can see that public health is not concerned with the best interest of the patient in that case. What they're really concerned with is increasing overall vaccination rates. And it feels a lot like they're willing to sacrifice patients in order to achieve that, even if it's not necessarily in their best interest, or at the very minimum, it is a higher risk choice for those patients.
And patients with Bell's palsy, that's another situation too, a bit of a broader category, isn't it?
Yeah, so Bell's palsy is also an adverse reaction that people can experience following a vaccination. It's also rare. Bell's palsy is a partial paralysis of your face, and it resolves for most people. It will go away on its own or with physical therapy. Not everyone. It takes a few months for Bell's palsy to resolve usually. But as you can imagine, living with facial paralysis, even for a short period of time, it can have a really big impact on someone's life. It's very, very upsetting for people who have developed Bell's palsy. And I think there have been about 500, last time I checked, about 500 cases across Canada of patients who developed Bell's palsy as an adverse reaction. But because in British Columbia, at least, I think in Ontario, patients who develop Bell's palsy would be able to find a physician who could support them, even though it is not life-threatening and it is a temporary condition. But I think you could probably find a sympathetic physician in Ontario who would support a medical exemption. in British Columbia and Manitoba, these are jurisdictions where approval of a medical exemption is subject to the government's approval, in addition to your physician writing you the note. And I think in those jurisdictions, a claim for a medical exemption because of an adverse reaction that caused Bell's palsy would probably be denied, because, as I said, it's not permanent and it's not life-threatening. So I just think it's not fair to these patients who have developed a condition that can have a very devastating emotional and mental toll on patients. It's very upsetting to develop facial paralysis, even if it's temporary, and to tell these patients, in addition to this trauma that you're experiencing, now you can't go out and be seen in these public places. And that's not right. And I think that the standard to get these exemptions in those jurisdictions, British Columbia and Manitoba, is just too high. We should accommodate these people.
So we've chatted a lot about these problem cases. Is there a province in this country that is doing a really good job with providing exemptions that you would look to say these other provinces should copy that one?
I would say that the best route is something like what Ontario has. Although I have heard from patients in Ontario who developed Bell's palsy who could not find a sympathetic physician to write them a note. Mm-hmm. But if I were to suggest a policy, if we're going to assume that vaccine passports are necessary, which I don't concede that. But mm-hmm. if the government's going to make the case that they need to accommodate medical exemptions, and they need to do it in a way that doesn't create bureaucratic barriers for the people who need them, to make it impossible to obtain, and the government cannot be interfering with the patient-physician relationship. They should butt out of that, and it should be between the physician and the patient, and the physician grants it, and the exemption is granted on the basis of the physician's decision. The concern, the broad concern is bad doctors, bad actors issuing these, $50 a pop for a medical exemption type thing, which happens. That certainly has happened. But the way you deal with that is through discipline through the regulator, not by making an exemption impossible to access for all these people who really need them.
Yeah, and I think that's a much better approach than what we're seeing, because then at least you have an easier route for people who truly need these exemptions to the passports. Again, keeping out of the whole debate about whether or not we should have passports, but if they are in place, I think there are certainly these cases where I think most Canadians, no matter what side of the debate you're on, would say, yeah, these people deserve them, especially in cases where they've already had the first vaccine and their body has shown that they have had an adverse reaction, and certainly those patients wouldn't want to risk their health again by getting a second dose. Is there anything that you'd like to add about this topic before we wrap up?
I would just say that the vaccine passports as a whole, I have a lot of concerns with. I have a concern that they engage our Section 7 rights to life, liberty, security, that we're creating an environment where people are sort of choosing between what they might perceive as their health and feeling coerced into taking a vaccine that they might not feel safe doing, because it is a higher risk choice for some people. Mm-hmm. I have some concerns about our Section 8 privacy rights, not because of what is contained in showing proof of vaccination. I think that's relatively minor disclosure of information. I have concerns that we can't necessarily trust the government to end it there, right? Is the government going to use that information for some other purpose? For example, if there's a crime committed on a street and the government is investigating the crime, would they be able to access the vaccine passport information from restaurants and bars that are on that street? I think that the police will certainly say that they want access to that information. Is that the type of society that we want to build? Mm-hmm. Another thing is we need an exit strategy for this. The pandemic is going to soon become endemic. There's no way of eliminating risk entirely in our life. What is the end game? Where is it going to be enough? When will vaccination rates be high enough and the risk be low enough? We need the government to be clear about when this is actually going to end. And we need to continue to reiterate to people that the situation that we're living in, where you need to show these documents in order to engage in public life, it is not normal and it should not become normal. And we should continue to express that this is an exceptional time and these are exceptional measures that are going to end at some point, and we should demand information about when that will end.
You know, I think you raised a good point. So often from the very start of this, we haven't seen a well thought out plan from the government to say, here's our exit strategy. It's just sort of, we keep stumbling from one set of rules and regulations to the next. I mean, we're still on 2 weeks to flatten the curve, I think, is the common quip on social media. And here we are close to 2 years now dealing with this, and governments really haven't provided that plan for how we're going to get out of this and make sure that any measures that they are imposing come with timestamps so that they are clearly temporary to all involved. Now, I know you've got a show on the News Forum. We didn't talk about that at the beginning, but if people want to watch your show on the News Forum, how do they find it?
Yeah, you can go on thenewsforum.com, or you can watch it on Bell or on Rogers. It's on cable TV if you like cable. We also post the episodes on the News Forum YouTube channel or the Canadian Justice YouTube channel. The show's called Canadian Justice. We talk about Canada's sort of most divisive or polarizing and interesting and important legal cases, from constitutional cases at the Supreme Court to business law issues to family law disputes. So it's a lot of fun to work on, and I have learned so much just in the last year doing the show.
Well, that's great. I know I've caught a couple episodes. It's always a great chat that you have on there. And then finally, what's the Canadian Constitution Foundation's website if people want to check out your research with them?
Yeah, visit the ccf.ca. We also have a petition up to end the vaccine passport policy. If that's something that you feel strongly about, sign our petition. And you can also tell us your story about how the policies has impacted you.
Perfect. Well, listen, thanks again, Christine.
Thank you so much.